I've been wanting to do a video about Google's Pixel phones for a while now, ever since the company announced kinda lackluster sales for the premium Pixel 3, but then turned right around and launched the far more budget-friendly Pixel 3a. Then, John Rettinger posted his video, provocatively titled, "No One Cares About the Pixel." And it's great. You should watch it. Link in the description. So that also got me thinking, Drac style, not so much about what the Pixel is, but why the Pixel is. What does its existence do for Google and for us? And if we're seeing that change with the 3A or with the 4, what does that mean? To help me figure it all out, I asked the man who literally got me started in this business. And yeah, that aside, one of the smartest people I know. Executive editor of The Verge and host of Processor on YouTube. Bohn. Hit subscribe and skull Vikings that bell gizmo so you don't miss any of the videos coming up next week. I'm Rene Ritchie, and this is Vector. Dieter, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really fun.
So I wanted to talk to you about the Pixel. I guess where it is today, where it's going in the future. Originally, there was the Nexus program, and I really loved the Nexus 1. It was like the future of Android a year in advance in your hand. But then subsequent Nexuses all felt different. Like some felt like summations of the year's Androids. Some felt like budget plays for developers. Some just maybe like experiments. Do you have any feeling of sort of what Google wanted to achieve with the Nexus program and why they felt the need to switch to something like Pixel?
I think you're exactly right that the goals for the Nexus program changed year to year. They always claimed it was meant to be sort of a demonstration device so that the rest of the ecosystem could learn how to make better Android devices. And in the early years, that was about like, well, we have the latest processor. We need to figure out how to make Android work on this latest processor, so we're going to do that. That became less and less important as time went on, and I think more Android manufacturers learned how to work with Qualcomm, honestly, and Qualcomm learned how to like make stuff easier for those manufacturers. And so, the later Nexuses sort of just got weird and frankly not that great. There's the Nexus 6, the Shamu Nexus was literally like code name for a whale because it was so big and fat. But I think that as the Nexus program became more and more diffuse in its purpose, they realized they needed to do a better job just selling hardware directly. And that's why they switched over to Pixel, which is made by Google. That's their tagline. But it's only really this year that the phone has honestly stopped being sort of like a Nexus made by Google and become like an actual Google phone.
All right, so you go back to the first Google, and that was the weird one for me because it was like the first phone made by Google, and that's weirdly dismissive of the Nexus program, but also it looks like an HTC phone. I wasn't clear what they wanted with that first one. Was it just meant to be to demo how you implement and update and support Android if you're Google?
I think so, and I think it was also to just start building that muscle because they didn't have it before. And they had the long-term plan of like properly unifying all of their hardware in something that's coherent instead of just whatever some random Googler wants to do in their 20% time. So I don't think they expected the first Pixel or the second Pixel, and maybe not even the third Pixel, to like really do super well in the market, but they needed to learn how to be a company that makes a phone. And the funny thing you mentioned about it looking like an HTC phone, like there's this weird thing with most phone manufacturers that aren't named Apple, where the division between the company that makes the phone and the factory that like actually builds the phone is actually a lot blurrier than you might think. Yeah. And so it's fair to call the first Pixel a Google phone, but it's also fair to say that the company that they worked with to make that phone had a big hand in developing it. And over the years, Google has wanted to like clarify that weird fuzzy boundary more and more and make sure more and more of it happens inside Google and not in the weird middle zone or just, at the factory.
So then we get into like Pixel 2, and that feels like the beginning of that Pixel thing because you start to get the camera. And it's not a super impressive sensor or lens, but they get the advent of real computational photography. And there are some issues like the screen stuff, which I guess we can talk about, but that felt like growing pains to me. But it was really when people started to notice that Google was doing something, and they put a lot of force behind that camera technology.
Yeah, the camera is definitely the story of the Pixel 2. The screen thing you mentioned, if anybody's not aware, the Pixel 2 XL had a OLED screen with really terrible muddy colors. Yeah. And the Android home buttons, the buttons on the bottom, you could see ghosting on it. And it was pretty prominent, more so than we've seen in other OLED phones. And so it was pretty unclear in the first month or so whether that was just standard OLED ghosting or if it was potentially real burn-in. And it caused quite a lot of drama. We actually pulled our review score for a while until it all got figured out, which made Google pretty unhappy. The cadence that I see, so Pixel 1 was like, let's learn how to make a phone. Pixel 2 was, okay, we're starting to get an idea here. Let's really flex our muscle on computational photography. And I think that they like, it was a generational leap compared to what was available when the Pixel 2 came out. It was that good. And the third one was a little bit of like, let's solidify our design language of what a Pixel phone looks like. You mentioned the Nexus phones earlier. The Nexus phones looked wildly different every single year. They completely would change. And that was because, Google picked different manufacturers, they know what they're doing. But the Pixel 2 coming out with the same sort of design language as the Pixel 1, just sort of refined, meant that, okay, now Google knows what it wants a phone to look like. Take it or leave it in some cases. I think that the design language is fine. I think it's nice. It's very simple and clean, but it's not very, elegant or high end or flashy.
And also, it was interesting because there were portrait modes before. Apple famously did it, and I'm blanking on who. I think Huawei might have done it before them as well, at least one other vendor. But they really went all in on it. And other companies responded by adding more cameras, like LG went to 3, and Samsung went to 3, and Huawei went to 3. Is that because you don't think they could compete with algorithms, or because they wanted to keep an optical edge, or just everyone was playing around with different camera technologies?
I think it's a mix of those things. I would say that they probably couldn't compete on just the computational side. And so they needed another lens to do it. But I think a better way to read like the proliferation of cameras on Android phones is to look at markets outside the US and even Canada, where specs actually matter a lot more to consumers than people realize. And so they really do count cameras and care. A really, really big market for Android is India. And in India, I think you would be shocked at the number of phones that get released. It's like one major one a week and one minor one almost every day. And how smart, read up, and like savvy users are in that market about specs on Android phones. And so, putting another camera on there actually does make a difference in terms of its marketability in different markets around the world.
So one of the things I noticed, especially at CES, because I had like Daniel Bader and Andrew Martinick with me, and they were shooting with the Pixel, and they loved the photos, but they hated the launch speed, and they hated when they didn't get photos saved. And I've noticed a lot of, like Marquez has complained about this, and Android Authority, and a bunch of people, and it's like this love-hate relationship. And is that just because algorithms and software are different, or because there's never enough RAM in a Pixel, or a bunch of different things?
So this is a complicated question.
That's why I have you here.
The end of the complication, which I'm going to go into, is Google done screwed up, and they should have fixed it, and they should still fix it. But so Pixel 1 was let's learn how to make a phone. Pixel 2 was we know how to make a really great camera, and we know our design language. Pixel 3 was, okay, we're making this phone more ourselves, and we actually want to focus a little bit more on the software experience, and make this feel like a fully, truly Google phone that has a bunch of Google services that is distinguished from other flavors of Android, or plain Android, which doesn't really exist on phones anymore. And so along with that, the onus was on Google to really nail the software experience. And I think that they just whiffed some like really basic stuff on RAM management. And so while the software is cleaner, easier to understand, easier to use, more Googleified than any other Android phone, honestly. I do think it's like easier to understand a Pixel phone than a Samsung phone, for example. Whiffing on some core memory management issues is bad. And it's especially bad when it primarily seems to, like, people notice it on the camera app. Like if you're losing a photo on a phone whose main selling point is the camera, that's just flat out unacceptable. And they've done some stuff to try and clean it up, but it's still happening. And it's a huge problem.
So then we had Google's recent results, and they sort of painted a picture that the Pixel wasn't selling that well. And I think most of us in the business just assumed it was selling okay, but not great, because it really never looked like they went out of their way to market it, to get it into carriers, to get it into point of purchase. But they also said something about, I don't know if it was flagship exhaustion or fatigue or something. And then they followed that up with the launch of the Pixel 3a, which is way more budget friendly. And is that sort of Google rethinking their overall Pixel strategy? Is that them trying to do what they did with Nexus and please different people with different phones? Or is it just like an evolution of their strategy?
I think it's an evolution. I think that we should anticipate a TikTok from them. I think it's likely that they'll probably have a flagship phone and then a low-end phone going forward, which, by the way, every big phone manufacturer does. It's just that their low-end phones are more expensive than the Pixel 3a happens to be, right? And so I think that, again, like Google really wants to be a big boy phone company, and that being a big boy phone company means selling multiple models at multiple price points. And so I think that's what the Pixel 3a is for. What's interesting about the Pixel 3a is it, there's a processor choice, fine, whatever you get, but they made different trade-offs about what goes in a budget phone or a value phone than anybody else does. Everybody else trying to make a value phone ends up compromising on the screen and the camera, basically. Google chose not to compromise on the camera and kind of chose not to compromise on the screen, honestly. They chose to compromise on the processor. So if you want to buy an Android phone for sub $500, you end up with a choice between this thing that's pretty fast but like takes garbage photos, or this thing that's not that fast but takes great photos. That's a weird decision, and I'm interested to see how it plays out.
I want to see the company choose to prioritize the camera and the processor and just let everything else go. Yeah,
well, I mean, we'll see. The question about is Google selling Pixels is incredibly vexing. They've, in the US, been exclusive to Verizon, although they'd work on any carrier. They also run Google Fi, if you count that as a real carrier, which is up to you. But the marketing was primarily done, through some Google stuff, but a lot of like letting Verizon handle it. But now with the 3A is available on all US carriers except AT&T, and the Pixel 3 is available on all US carriers except AT&T, like actually sold in the store. And I'm told that they're not planning on radically expanding their marketing budget. So it's just always been the conventional wisdom that just there aren't that many Pixel phones sold. I think that's probably true. That Google saw a dip last quarter, I think, is partially due to an overall dip in smartphone sales, especially at the high end, and partially due to the fact that the Pixel is on a weird cadence relative to the availability of smartphone components. And this is actually kind of important. So like Apple, Google likes to release its phones in the fall. So it does it in October typically. It turns out that the way that Qualcomm releases its processors, though, is their newest generation is typically available in the spring. And so unless Google can get a jump on that or change its cadence, it's always going to have a processor in it that is going to get supplanted by other Android phones within 4 to 6 months of its release. And so that's just going to be a thing that happens to them over and over again. And I think that Google's going to need to make some hard choices about when it releases its phones, how premium and expensive it wants to make them. Because right now, a Pixel phone looks fine, it looks nice, but it looks nowhere near as impressive as an S10 or an iPhone. And if it's playing in that price category, it needs to be a more impressive object than it currently is.
Yeah, and you mentioned the processors, and I heard a rumor a few years ago that primarily the then new CFO really wanted like an iPhone, a Galaxy phone, a Huawei top tier, soup to nuts, made by Google phone, all the way from the silicon to like the interface. And they were putting together that team. They poached a bunch of people from Apple. They got a bunch of people from Qualcomm, other companies, and they were working on it. But just like a couple weeks ago, we heard that they lost a lot of those people, and that division may not go forward. We may not even see Pixel cores anymore. And I wonder if that's a change in strategy, or Qualcomm is just getting good enough that it's not worth the investment in consumer silicon. And to your point, they're releasing their lower silicon phone when Qualcomm's releasing their better silicon. Can they make all that work, or should they do their own stuff?
There's a lot of things going on there, and I don't have any inside information about it, honestly. I don't know how committed Google was to trying to make its own core main processor CPU. I suspect that problem is much harder than anybody realizes.
Oh yeah.
Of course, it took Apple a long time. Around the world, most people just use Qualcomm stuff. Qualcomm obviously has a ton of patents and a ton of know-how. Samsung and Huawei have managed to make their own processors for their phones. So Samsung has Exynos and Huawei has Kirin. but they generally don't they don't play as well as Qualcomm's. Honestly, they don't work as well with modems, and they don't work as well with like 4G and now soon 5G is the assumption. And so it's a really hard problem. Now, whether they lost that team because like they bailed on making their own ARM processor or not, I don't know. I do know that 3 years after releasing their first real Google phone, to expect them to like have a processor is not super realistic. I think it takes longer than people realize, and even Apple, it took longer than people realize, and I think that they managed to move much faster to get their processor on the iPhone than anybody else could, especially in the way that the Android market works right now.
So how do you feel about platform companies competing against their own OEMs, their own vendors? We see Microsoft doing it with the Surface, Google's doing it now with the Pixel, and smartly they target Apple. You know, like the billboards say Phone X, and it's pretty apparently Apple. Even though my friends who switched to Pixel, they switched from other Android phones, and just because there's zero cost of making that switch if you're already using Android, and it's a little bit less convenient if you're not. So it seems like the actual churn is from other Android vendors, but should they be better platform citizens? And for example, instead of making a Pixel phone, should Google just make that camera app available for every Android vendor, so every Android camera is way better than any other platform?
I think it's important for them to be in the hardware business as strictly as an insurance policy. If they had let the market do what it wanted to, Samsung would start doing crazy stuff, and then Google would have to yell at them and say, like, would you please calm down? Or, maybe Huawei would have become even more ascendant. They're, number one or number two up until a couple weeks ago. And then all of a sudden, like, bam, they get shut down. So running your own hardware division means you have a little bit more control of your own destiny in a scary, changing world. I also think that the traditional rules of can a platform maker also sell competing products with the other OEMs that participate have changed. So like the classic stuff that everybody has in their head is Apple when it had third-party Macs and like Palm, right? Yeah. Way back in the day. And there was some real cannibalization of the market there that was like real, and like they had to fix that. I think now the market is big enough, and companies like Google and Microsoft aren't throwing that much weight behind trying to like dominate the market. And so it ends up sort of being like an easy piece to maintain. And that may be one of the reasons that like the Pixel is very nice, but it's not like, oh my God, this is the best phone ever, except for the camera year after year.
So we're starting to see rumors about the Pixel 4. And a long time ago, I think before the Pixel 2, one of the rumors I heard is that Google really wanted like a sealed, a complete slab phone, 0 ports, 0 buttons, anything. And we've already...
Can I just ask you a personal question, Renee?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You've been talking about portless, buttonless phones for like 5 years. Why do you want this to happen so badly?
I don't. So there's been this big delete the bezel movement. And when you talk to manufacturers, a lot of them think that hardware, if they can remove hardware, they will remove hardware failure. Like get rid of the home button. No one's home button ever fails anymore. Get rid of the headphone jack. So much easier to make it waterproof so someone doesn't plug in. It is waterproof, but then you plug in your headphones and it shorts out. There's all these things. And it just, if we humans would stop pressing things and sticking things in, they'd have their beautiful slab. And for a while, I've heard that Google was like super aggressive. They just couldn't get that remote restore working. And I wonder if because they are so good at server-side technology, they could be the first one there. We might all hate it, but they still could be the first one there.
I think they could. I don't think next year is the year for them to do it, or this year, actually, either year. I think that charging speeds just aren't fast enough via wireless charging to like make that feasible, regardless of whether or not they can make Android sort of stable enough to be able to do, complete remote control of it. There's still some weird little things that are like twitchy about it. Now, if you want to get deep into like Android platform nerdery, they have started building out the pieces to make something like that possible, because Android now, when you do an update, especially in Android P and now in Q, it downloads the entire OS into an entirely separate partition, and then it checks that the partition is good, and then it slips your OS over to that one, and then they can put another update on the other one. And so it's much less likely that it's going to get into a completely failed state, because there will always be at least one partition running a known good OS on it.
Dieter, I have one last question for you. What do you think we'll see first, iMessage on Android or Google Camera on iPhone?
Man, both of those things are incredibly unlikely because of the platform lock-in decisions that each company has made. I think that for the foreseeable future, Google's like number one advantage is its camera technology, and it doesn't even want to share with other Android makers. So it seems unlikely that they would put it on the iPhone unless there's a crazy way for them to make a ton of ad money on it, which seems unlikely. I also don't think Apple would give them enough camera access low level to do that in the first place. And, you know, iMessage on Android, I still would like Apple to just charge $20 a month and do it. But you know, it seems unlikely.
Apple Prime, you sign up for TV, you get the messaging thrown in.
Yeah.
Dieter, thank you so much.
You know what they could do? They should. You can sign up for iMessage for $20 a month, but 15 of those dollars get put in a special fund that you can use on Apple products down the road. And so after a year on iMessage on Android, you would be able to go and buy an iPhone, and then you'd be able to, you know, have a little bit of money left over to like buy some apps that you have to replace. Think about
that's
it.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. They might be calling you. They might be calling you.
Yeah, I shouldn't have given that idea away for free. It's too bad.
Dieter, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, you bet. It was fun.
You can find Dieter at Backlon on social, and you can read him on The Verge, and you can also watch him in a bunch of their videos and in his own processor show on The Verge's YouTube. Now, one of the coolest or quirkiest, you tell me, things about Google is how they experiment with all sorts of different products. Nexus phones. Hold my beer. Have you seen the Nexus Q? They'll buy Nest. They'll make Pixel phones, but also weird-ass Pixel tablets. But one thing they haven't made yet is anything like Molecule. I've been using mine for months now, ever since my nerdy friends in Silicon Valley showed me the results they were getting, especially during the wildfires, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That's because Molecule has technology that's capable of destroying air pollutants at a molecular level. Its technology has been verified by science, but more importantly, it's been tested by real people in the real world, and that's what makes it so compelling. Molecule helped allergy and asthma sufferers around the country better cope with their conditions and significantly reduce their symptoms. To get yours, go to molecule.com, that's MOLEKULE.com, and enter Vector at checkout to save $75. Thanks, Molecule, and thanks to all of you for supporting the show. So, I think for Google, it's important to keep making hardware. I absolutely think they should shut up about how great they are at making it, because given all the issues, it ends up being like the ongoing gaslighting they're doing over the meaning of the word privacy. It just rings false and engenders distrust. If they really want to sell it, then fine, sell it, but act like you want to sell it. I kind of think, though, that Google should go the other way. Just treat it like a test bed, a grand experiment, with every year being something new and novel that might work, might have some issues, but in some way just pushes the industry forward. And then, yeah, release the camera app for every device. Google gets even more data, which they love, and everyone gets better computational photography, which everyone loves. Google may stop being the best camera phone, but so what? Who cares? Has Google ever really wanted or needed to be the best camera company? They don't really withhold assistant much, if at all anymore, and they kind of really do want to be the best AI company. The nerds who love Google will still buy Google. So will people who just want a really good budget Android phone in general. Would that be a win-win? You tell me. Hit like, hit subscribe, and then hit up the comments below and let me know. Where do you want to see Google go with the Pixel next? Thank you so much for watching, and see you next video.